So the first thing we wanted to talk about today is DeepSeek. Chris and I did talk about it in last week's episode, but that was a hot take. We're now about 10 days in. The dust has started to settle. I think we can actually do a bit of a warm take on where things are at. So, I guess there's sort of two things that I've noticed, and then folks, if you want to jump in. First is that the markets have largely shrugged it off. Nvidia fell a lot when the hype sort of built up, and, Microsoft and the rest to a lesser extent. They've largely recovered or at least stabilized. And then the other, I think, in some sense, more interesting thing is OpenAI has actually been forced into reaction by this. So first of all, they've released O3 Mini and they released it with its chain of reasoning, which originally they weren't going to do, but DeepSeek R1 does that. And so they decided to compete. And then Sam Altman actually said that he was considering releasing some of the OpenAI models open source. DeepSeek, of course, released their models open source, and said he's starting to think that OpenAI might be on the wrong side of history by keeping their models closed source. So what are our thoughts on all this?
I just feel like, why does it take crisis for these things to happen? I mean, I appreciate, I guess, him responding in some way and like taking some responsibility. I think one of the ironic parts of this and twists is OpenAI and Sam complaining, or it seems like, the overall energy of complaining how DeepSeek is stealing from them when they've been stealing from content publishers and all that. And that's been a big thing in the entertainment industry, like, stealing content and like the whole tension between publishers and media and these lawsuits happening. It's like the pot calling the kettle black.
The irony is delicious.
And I talked about that in my newsletter. Check it out. So I thought that was somewhat comical. And then also what's coming out now is this whole thing. Did DeepSeek actually build itself for 6 million? Was it really 500 million? I thought that was also a bit in the air, which was interesting to come out because all of this was such like just a big press hit that created so much reaction across the industry. And of course, it's not like the full story all the time, which also goes back to how we respond to these things and how quickly it can create like some real world impact. And I think we should all watch out for that in some ways, but it is what it is.
I wrote on social that I think DeepSeek was a very big hit for VCs that invested in foundational models. If you're an investor in OpenAI, if you're an investor in Anthropics, then this is a competition for you. But as a user of AI, I love competition. Bring it more. I want AI from Vietnam. I want AI from India. I want AI from everywhere because I want this commodity to have competition. And I think that's, for a developer, for all the startups that are using AI, what's called the wrappers, this is great news because now they have alternatives. I don't mind if Sam Altman is dragged to do the right thing as long as he's doing the right thing. From my perspective, bring on more DeepSeeks around the world.
I mean, that's just sort of old school capitalism, right? It's like competition is good. Competition drives innovation and it drives, faster movement. And I think OpenAI's reactions are exactly that. I think it's very interesting that it feels like with Sam's remarks also that open source might be starting to win, which is also interesting for those who develop foundational models. But, I think to your point, Amir, you said the VCs who are backing these foundational models are probably the ones who should be scared. Like, I think there's a couple of things that are interesting here. So first of all, companies like Microsoft, Google, Meta, their stock prices fell a bit and then they either stabilized or kind of bounced partly back up, similar for Nvidia. And also, OpenAI have basically announced a new raise backed by SoftBank at a $370 billion valuation. That's with a B. So it doesn't seem like after all that sort of panic and that media cycle, it's like, oh my God, DeepSeek's going to change everything. People have kind of absorbed the news, digested it, decided that it's more or less business as usual, which to me is nearly, it feels nearly as much of an underreaction as the initial reaction felt like an overreaction.
Do you feel like also some of it, and I'd love both your takes on this, like the US like saying like, we want to plant our flag, like you can't compete with us, like besides the government putting up these regulations, and now this senator also introduced this bill to make it so like AI can't come from China, and like this continued control of AI in the US versus China. Do you think that that was also their way of kind of doing a little bit of a power move in some ways of like, you see, it didn't make a difference. We've still got it.
I think you can't block innovation in this way. You can try, but at the end of the day, it's going to be an American company that's going to take DeepSeek as an open source and implement a cloud service for it. So I think as the government ability to control world global innovation is very limited. I think what we're seeing is a new commodity that is very, very powerful. That's why I think investing in it as a whole is a very good strategy. And what we're seeing is more competition coming from all over the world, which is only reasonable and at the end of the day, good for everyone, even for Microsoft and Google, because it could be that the next wave of innovation, not LLMs, but the next thing that is definitely needed will come from somewhere else.
I have a question for both of you guys about like national security, that issue. Like that continues to be a big thing, specifically coming from China.
I mean, my feeling on it is whatever you think about it, it's somewhat irrelevant. I think that's sort of what Amira was trying to say, is that it's kind of like, especially, it's fascinating to see a Chinese company using open source, which is in a sense kind of like the weapon of freedom, right, to circumvent this. Because once you have things open source, you can no longer really regulate them. And, you know, the thing I'm thinking about, the last time this played out was probably around 20 years ago around cryptography, where the US government kind of wanted to keep control over the strongest cryptographic algorithms so that they could crack things and, you know, they could surveil. But the open source movement took that option out of their hands, right? Because the strongest crypto was available open source for anyone to download, compile, and use. And so you can pass whatever regulations you want, but it's irrelevant. And from the national security point of view as well, you could say, well, DeepSeek is compromised because it comes from China, and there's certainly evidence that's the case. But because all of their methodologies are open source, now someone in the US, or to Amira's point, someone in India, in Kenya, wherever, can take those techniques and build their own DeepSeek-like model without those Chinese biases, or, you know, to put a slightly more cynical point on it, with their own biases that they choose to input into it. So, like, open source is really good at taking genies out of bottles, and that's sort of what DeepSeek seems to have done here.
I'm very worried about a service coming from China. I'm very not worried about code coming from China, open source code, because exactly what Yaniv said, like, we could have a Denmark-based company that reviews the code, says, hey, it's legit, we added some modification, now we're hosting it, we're the data sovereigns of it. I wouldn't trust a data sovereignty of China. I think a service, I told my friends not to download the app itself, but the code that runs the AI is very solid, and we could run it in the US and compete with OpenAI. And if you want, the three of us could raise a lot of money doing that. That's wonderful. That's exactly what the market needs to do.
So before we move on from this DeepSeek situation, do we think OpenAI at $370 billion, given what's just happened, do we think that's overvalued?
I mean, for context, like how much was NVIDIA valued for? How much is Meta or Facebook when it was popping? And
well, those guys are in the trillions, right? But I think 370 billion makes OpenAI the 15th most valuable company on Earth?
I think it's unreasonably priced, but everything is unreasonably priced. Everything is hyped now. We have lost the path of reasonably pricing something based on income, based on logic, based on anything. We're pricing it based on a dream. And the dream that OpenAI has is worth even more than what they're valued, because if they have general AI, they will change the world. So I guess it's a bet of like, how much do you believe in their crazy ass dream? And there's not a lot of any other data to prove any other thesis.
Would it also be based on users? Would it be like its vision, its innovation, proprietary tech users? No.
Just vision. We're going to have GAI, general AI, that will be able to do everything. That is the bet.
Yeah.
All the rest is like marginal.
I mean, I just think in the context of DeepSeek, what's interesting is how quickly people shrugged off. Like I said, there was this sort of news cycle of like AI as a like foundation model business, to your point, Amir, is, if not doomed, has been largely devalued because suddenly we're playing in a commodity space. And it just feels that within a week, without really, I mean, markets don't have to explain themselves, but without a really good explanation, the markets have been like, actually, never mind, business as usual. We're still going to assume that AI value will accrue massively to those who are building those foundational models.
I can explain, right? Let's look at another commodity that we all use all day, right? Cloud services. We're now running on, this conversation is running on cloud services. And you have Amazon, you have Microsoft, and you have Google. Not a lot of people are using Google in our mind, but still they're making billions of dollars. I think about 40% of Google revenue comes from their cloud, which is the third cloud. So even if you say OpenAI will be the third in this race, they'll still valued correctly because it's going to be a third of infinite amount of money to be made with AI in the future, if you believe in the bet.
What I think is more worrisome, I guess, than the tech stocks around it, and I did post a video about this. I'm always going to preface everything, and I did a post about it. There's a newsletter.
Absolutely. You should absolutely follow Shira, everybody.
It was more about again, the political part of this component to this, what's coming from this around the government and regulation. I think this is something to keep track of more than necessarily the tech stocks around it. And this is something I think that's going to creep up on us. And I do worry that a lot's going to happen behind the scenes that we're not going to really see until it's possibly too late. Kind of like what happened with TikTok. And then again, everyone's going to be up in arms. And again, my worry is if, depending on what happens with TikTok, which we've almost forgot about how quickly the news cycle, like no one's talks about TikTok right now. Like I want to be like, and remember, it's how many days until TikTok possibly shuts down again. That sets a precedent for a lot of these other tech companies and innovation. And again, it's like as everyone talks about, the oligarchy that happens and what that will do for the economy and for us, as our stance internationally as well, and collaboration, and I mean, all of it. There's so much and control, right? In terms of global power, because AI impacts so many things, culture, economics, military. We forget there's so many nuances to this and why the US is trying to take control in so many ways that gets swept under the rug. I don't know. Do any of you have thoughts on that?
My thought is that I was very worried that today Google has removed the pledge to not weaponize AI from their website. What you're saying is actually very timely because they said, oh, you remember not doing bad? We're going to do some bad. Basically, that's what they said with their removing that from their website. They said that like AI will not be used for weaponization and surveillance, and they removed that clause. The TechCrunch reported on that today. I think what you're saying is very worrisome. I think the combination of government and corporate is becoming very vague in the last few weeks, if not a few months, and AI is going to be at the center of this storm.
Yeah, it's really hard not to talk about politics in this context, right? But yes, I think the mood has completely changed, and I think the administration in the US in particular is really about just maximizing untrammeled power. It's not about balances or anything like that. And so it's like, of course, AI is very powerful militarily, and also I think there's a legitimate argument to be made that, well, it is sort of an arms race, and if there's an arms race, you kind of have to participate in it, which is that unfortunate dynamic where you end up with things like nuclear weapons because you're worried that someone else is going to get them. Yeah, sure. I think that's going to be a thing. But unfortunately, it strikes me as naive that AI is not going to be heavily used for military purposes. And so if I'm probably imagining the conversation at Google this is going to happen anyway. There's a lot of money to be made if we do it. There's also a lot of political favor to be gained if we cooperate with the military on this. So let's kind of just do it. And it's probably the right commercial decision.
I have a question because I was just thinking about other moments in tech. So many of the big companies, I was thinking of Samsung. I don't know, there's others. I feel like you go to CES and there's so many big tech companies that we all use that are leaders that are not based in the US. And why has that not been an issue? I guess as a consumer, I think about consumer technology, right? And how so much of it isn't from the US. I mean, there's Apple and there's everyone else, and so many things were not from the US. I feel like now we're hearing more and more publicly that like, if this is not from the US, there's an issue. Like, obviously, if it's from a foreign adversary, this, that, and like keeping things here. Like, when did that start? And I feel like it wasn't such a big deal in the past to have a tech and a huge company that was worth a huge amount that we were all like using, not being from here.
If you were security minded,
yeah,
it was always an issue.
Okay.
So like if you were security minded, you wanted a system that was safe and secure. By the way, you didn't trust the US government more than you would trust any other government for that. So you would build your own. A lot of my like security-minded friends have their own Android with their own versions. But that's super geeky.
Yeah, exactly.
We've started learning about this in media when it became the political thing to do, because Trump is driving separatism. So now it's cool to talk about technology not from the US. Just like it's cool to talk about energy not coming from the US or anything not coming from the US, right? 65% of all vegetables and fruits coming from Mexico, not cool anymore.